Yeah, we need some energy in the room. All right. I'm going to read this here from my notes here, but I want you to know and welcome Katie from the East Coast. East Coast. Welcome to New Mexico, Katie. Katie is passionate about DevOps and DevSecOps community since her days of working with COBOL and mainframe solutions. You heard that right, folks. COBOL and mainframe solutions. At Reversing Labs, she collaborates with developers and security researchers to help entities prioritize their open source risk, reduce technical debt, and meet compliance objectives. When she's not working with developer community, she loves running, traveling, hanging out with her dog, Milo. I love dogs too. All right, take it away. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Oh, good. Now we're live. Okay. Okay. Perfect. So, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited. This is actually my first solo speaking engagement, so this is a big deal for me personally, but I'm very excited to be. Sorry, I'm also excited to be out here in New Mexico for my second time, so thank you. Before we dive into this though, I just want to get the temperature of the room. Is who has heard of the video game Oregon Trail? We got one, two, okay, we got more than I thought. If you don't know what it is, who has seen Yellowstone? You will fit right in. Okay, we'll be fine. So I'm gonna have a lot of bad jokes in here today, so hang in there with me. Hopefully you learned something. So a little bit about me. I'm Kadi McKean, as he mentioned. So I'm actually a community manager at Reversing Labs. What does that mean? It means like I'm a little agent of chaos who interacts with the open source community and trying to help improve security posture. Other than that, I also run my own podcast. It's called 10x Insights, where we talk with people from development and application security to learn more. Okay, thank you. It's okay. To make sure we're sharing insights, so it's everything, like it's something everyone should know. It shouldn't be kept as a hidden secret, right? So a little bit about Reversing Labs. We're in the top 20% of Fortune 100 companies, but you guys can read off the slide. I'm not here to talk about this today, so I like this slide when it talks about just who we are, because at a high level we have a 27 petabyte data lake. If that doesn't strike you as massive, it should. So in our DNA, we're actually a malware binary-based analysis company. So we have this huge data lake of all these scary things so that we can run our own behavioral analysis and talk a little bit more about what we're talking today. So, agenda. I hope you like 8-byte photos, because that is what you will be seeing a lot of today. But today we're going to talk about what the trail is, the gating process, cutting corners, common deaths on the trail, sudden disasters, and then if we have time for questions. So, this is the Oregon Trail. I tried to find one that was within the green screen vein, but they all looked a little weird, so this is the best one that I saw where you can kind of see it from the 1800s. So, as you can tell, this journey, it's a 2,000-mile journey, right, where people are leaving from Independence, Missouri, and they're going all the way out to Minot Valley out in Oregon. So along that route, there is some crazy stuff that can happen and a lot of different ways you can die. Hopefully, as many of you remember from the game, right? Just like Oregon Trail, though, survival in modern software development really requires preparation, wise decisions, and the right tools. So we're gonna get into that and how we can really win the game against these modern challenges in software development. So, what does our trail look like? This is the trail I'm going to be talking about today. And this is where you're going to really see there's different stages for build, develop, test, deploy. And then updating, right? Because you're running that constant feedback loop, because in today's world, it's not a matter of if something bad's gonna go wrong, it's a matter of when, right? And I wish I had a crystal ball so I could be better at predicting that, but we're not there yet. So, the key here though is what I want you to pay attention to is the gating process. So, there's strong security checkpoints along the way, and that's to try and help hinder things like malicious code getting injected or cause a catastrophic failure. So we do have these checkpoints in place. It's just a matter of how well they're followed, right? So the other thing that I found interesting about the game, right, is there's actually 3 different players you can be. So who chose to be a banker, who chose to be a carpenter, anyone choose? I always went for the farmer. I don't know why, but I just thought it was cool. But each of these roles, right, they have a different resource amount. So maybe it's more sheep if you're a farmer, or more seeds, whereas if you're a carpenter, you have access to tools. So you have to really choose your role wisely, and much like the farmer, banker, and carpenter, today's players are similar, right? Everybody's got a different skill set. They have different resources available to them, and they have a different perspective in mind when what they're for day-to-day actions. So their end goal is a little bit different than someone else's. So, for example, developers really just care about shipping code fast. We want to get those features out the door quick, right? And then security. We want to make sure we're shipping secure code and hopefully preventing vulnerabilities. But we'll get to why it's just more than vulnerabilities in a second. And then operations. So operations wants to make sure things are running smoothly from each part of the different process, moving through the gating procedure, as well as then once it's in maintenance mode, they want to make sure nothing's going on. So everything should be running seamlessly. And again, different understanding, different goals they have, and they have a different little bit of a thought process when it comes to this. So, as I was talking, we were talking about these different checkpoints. So, for those of you familiar with the game, you'll remember there's, a blue river crossing, there could be a fork crossing, and all of these are different stages where you're like, yes, I've made it, or like, okay, I'm a little bit safer. That's kind of how you feel when you're doing the different parts of the gating process in software development. So once you move to the next stage, you should be feeling a little bit more safer, knowing that they have passed certain security checkpoints, right? So the feature that the developer made, it's made it into, say, like production, it should have had certain checkpoints to go along the way. What I think is interesting, right, is Q&A, right? So Q&A used to be something that not everyone would do, but now we're seeing everyone worried about Q&A, especially from AppSec, and more people are worrying about it. So we're starting to see, like, for example, folks at OWASP meetups, you never really saw, like, QA mentioned, but you are starting to see more of that now. The main point I wanted to talk about here is that if you skip these different checkpoints, you can risk losing everything downstream, and no security tests will be released to just focus on vulnerabilities, right? You have to be aware of other things that are going on here. So where do we integrate some of these testing points, right? So I talked about the different checkpoints, and this is kind of what it looks like in a perfect world, or one idea of a perfect world where we're injecting those security tests. And why? Why can we do this? Is because we can inspect large software binaries, where we can be kind of that last line of defense before you push it into production. So it's a final build inspection, right? I think that's all I wanted, yeah, because you guys know this stuff, right? Okay, so we've talked about the different gating points, but we haven't talked about shortcuts. So who out here has looked for a shortcut they can take? Like, let's be honest, like I'm right there too. If I can take one, I probably will. The problem with that is, in regards to software development, is that you're gonna have some problems, whether that's, if you're taking a shortcut in compliance, you're probably gonna have someone come talk to you from legal at a later date and time, which really, I don't know about you, but I personally never wanna be in a lawyer's office unless it's like for something good and I'm inheriting like $3 million. That's not usually how this goes. So you could end up in a lawyer's office. If you're missing some of these steps too for that final build inspection, you could be more vulnerable to malware injections, misconfigured pipelines, incomplete vulnerability tracking. There's a variety of different things that could go wrong here. So a few of the common themes I just wanted to point out real quick is pitfalls when it comes to cutting corners usually is compliance and SBOM, so those two are your friends. Secure CID pipelines is also something you want to make sure you're not taking a shortcut on, and making sure you're choosing the right open source components. So let's get into some real world examples, because this little GIF is only so fun. So what's wrong with this picture here? Anybody have an idea? So do you know why anybody would want to make a package with an extra Y? So this is what we call typo squatting. So that's where people are maliciously and intentionally using, fat finger basically, or putting an extra Y on it because they think someone's just going to grab the package because, hey, I use cryptography all the time. Because it's written so similar and looks so similar, it's hard to know that there is malware injected in here. But there are tools out there where you can do a quick inspection like this and see that, hey, something is definitely not right here and it's not passing my sniff test or what I want to look at. So what do we want to look about? Here's another example too. So this one actually happened to me in real time. I was at PyCon and someone wanted to look up the request package. It's a very common package used in PI. And I almost had a heart attack being like, it wasn't failing yesterday, so what happened? But hey, you put an extra U in there and now you got malware. So let's talk about another event. Anybody had plans to enjoy their Christmas, New Year vacation in late 2021, early 2022? Or did anybody else were they just ready for a fire drill? Always ready? Yeah, stop, drop, and roll, guys. It will help. I don't know if it will in this situation. Let's talk about Log4Shell though. Anybody remember this? I know it personally did a lot of weird stuff to my holiday schedule, which I didn't care for, but I'm only on the community side, so I just remember looking at one of my colleagues being like, dude, have you slept in 3 days? I'm like, do you know where this is? How are you gonna fix it? So when we're talking about Log4Shell, it's a heavily used open source library in the Java community. We kind of wanna, I don't wanna harp on it too much, but it kind of is a little mini celebrity vulnerability that became known from this. So what happened? Something functionally was added in 2013, right? And it was added to Log4j by a guy named Ralph Goers. Ralph isn't, he's not a nation state threat actor implementing vulnerability with schemes to exploit it later. He was just an unassuming guy from the US who's just, I've got some Java knowledge and I want to help out the open source community. So he contributed. Well, back in 2013, that commit turned out to be what became the unmitigated disaster 8 years later and ruined a lot of people's holidays. So what this did is it allowed for remote and often unauthenticated users to execute arbitrary code on their server. So that's about as bad as it gets. I mean, anybody else think there's something worse than that? I mean, that's pretty bad. And to this day, it was one of few CVEs that got a CVSS score of 10, which is, again, literally as bad as it gets. So what I thought was interesting, and the reason why I like this example is that nobody noticed the vulnerability until late 2021, early 2022, which ultimately, forced the public disclosure. And it's just wild to me that it took 8 years to find this. But again, people are injecting these little ticking time bombs, so they're just waiting for it to get picked up or looked at one day. And again, you just don't know when. So, all right, what about this one? Does anybody remember UA parsers? This also happened about 2021, right, November, so we're thinking of again, holiday season. I like Thanksgiving. This wasn't really fun. So UA, with this one, what I thought was interesting is that This is where credentials got stolen. So the hacker actually gained access to the maintainer's NPM account, right? And published 3 malicious packages, which contained, was right in the pre-install script. So it executed automatically upon installation to involve a crypto miner, targeting Windows and Linux, and ultimately a Windows password stealing Trojan. So again, another wild example of something that could go wrong if we're not putting best practices in place. Sorry, I'm new here. So this is also one thing that I like to show too, is just you can see how easy it is to detect these packages and what's wrong. So you can get a quick visual and you're like, hey, red means no, yellow, maybe, right? It depends on what your level of risk tolerance is, how your environment's configured. But it's a really good way for you to be able to decide, what you're willing to take on here. And then we've talked about this, right? So we're starting to build in more and more of these testing procedures and making sure we're having more gating points in there, so that way, if something is found, it's hopefully after it's in production. So your testing gets a little bit more noisy, right? So this is where I'm trying to articulate, right, that there's a lot of different noise you're going to be getting with these tools, whether it's free open source tools, a tool you commercially buy. They're all going to have some type of noise, so you have to figure out which signals are the ones you need to be listening to the most. Maybe that's, only CVSS 10s. Some of us like to look at them, for 7 and up, but again, it just depends. So this is also just showing too where there's other types of checks you can be doing, so it's not all vulnerabilities or typo spawning type stuff. We're also talking about compromising it at CIC or tampering. So that's where you're looking at different versions where this version's okay, but then someone injected malware in that one. So you want to try and figure out what the diff is between the two, so hey, this is what happened, this is how we can adjust it. And it's also good to see that there's a history, right? In a lot of these packages, I personally like to know, are these ones getting tampered with more often than others? Because if it is getting tampered with, you have a higher likelihood of being attacked, just based off looking at its previous history, right? So, the moment you guys have all been waiting for, right? How am I getting back to Oregon for this? So, we've talked through a bunch of these different options today, and this is just where I came up with. So, dysentery is malware, right? So you're going to have CVE, CVSS, vulnerabilities, but to be honest, malware trumps vulnerability any day of the week. So snakebite, you'll see, is that vulnerability exploit, because that's still really bad. You might have a couple holes in your arm, maybe die of poison. Starvation is that dependency confusion we were talking about. Hunting accident is always my favorite, because you haven't lived unless you played the game and you actually were involved in a hunting accident. It was very sad, but it happened, okay? And that's CI/CD misconfiguration. So cold exposure, just typo spotting, right? So that's adding that extra Y, adding that extra U. But I know, what about the elephant in the room, right? What about AI? So AI also is providing its own unique form of deaths for us, right? So we've already started to see some of this happening where vulns, we're starting to see are more AI agent based. So if you think about things anybody hear of the Disney attack that happened last year? That was a good one. I don't know, maybe it's because I'm a big mouse head, but I found this one to be truly interesting. So this guy who unassumingly downloaded a malicious file disguised as an AI image generation tool. Wow, let me tell you, yeah, you're laughing because you know where this is going. He granted basically an unauthorized access to their personal computer in downloading that agent. So this guy had a couple terabytes of data from Disney's private servers, 44,000 messages off Slack. He knew the product roadmap, where you guys were looking to go, other documentation of doomsday scenario. That is not stuff you want publicly available, and this guy did publish it. So that guy lost his job, unfortunately. I think he tried to fight it, but I I don't know how you come back from that, but the point being though is it could look like it's a helpful little tool. You need to vet out these tools though before you're downloading them, right? Because we're starting to see more and more of these types of attacks coming in through developer tooling, whether that's like a VS Code extension or an AI image generating tool. You can also tell that malware in large language models, we have been seeing more and more of that, so it's going to become more commonplace, right? Just as hard as we're working to keep these guys out, they have a whole team, and they're working, if not harder, to even get in. So with more tools being available like AI or LLMs, we're going to start seeing more and more of these attacks happening. They're not going to be novel, like one-off things. There's also the learned bias, right? So the hunting accent could just be like, hey, Katie's just not a great player, so that's why she's having this accent. But there's also a learned bias in that, we're teaching these large language models what we want to do without thinking of full, all different options of what could occur, right? So it's only thinking from my point of view, where it's not including maybe 3 other people's point of view. So you have to realize that it's probably not capturing everything you want it to. And then, there's always the in real life Armageddon, and that's basically Skynet, and we're all just slaves to robots. So, that's something to look forward to too. The other thing I wanted to talk about is, how many of you have heard of Jim Manico? Okay, so I'm glad no one does, because this is very helpful for me to teach you guys a moment. Jim Manico is a friend of one of my colleagues, and you might be hearing about vibe coding, where AI is heavily used in the software development space. Well, Jim Manico is a premier educator in the area of secure coding and secure application development. So he's also a speaker at many of these application security conferences in the OAuth space, but lately he's been commenting and really shouting from the rooftop about how AI creates horribly insecure code, right? So to address that, he's actually built some prompt engineering rules, some scripts that can help with AI. So if you're looking to use more AI, but using it more securely, call this guy. He's really good at it, and he's just a really great educator and well-respected. We're cruising. I know I have 5 minutes left, so I'm cruising. So pickle files, right? This is also something, it's not the pickles you eat, but these are pickle files in Python. So where can you find the malware in the model, right? So this is something that we are starting to see a lot more of. And it's really just sticking with the whole AI theme, right? It's a very popular data model within ML. Pickle file is really just a serialized data set, and when the file is uploaded, it gets deserialized, right? So it turns out that this allows for threat actors to really embed attacks for pickle files quite easily, and those attacks are executed in the deserialization process. So some of the bad things can be done, including spawning processors on the machine, communicating with the network, or even executing code, which always is fun. So what you see here at the bottom are some of those checks that Reversing Labs does to help you when it comes to pickle files. So just thought that was cool to highlight. So we've talked through a bunch of these different options, right, where there's really 3 different types of ways we've seen some of these coming in. There's more, don't get me wrong, but the 3 big ones I've been talking about with some different examples are the state-sponsored attacks. We've been seeing them for decades, right? Supply chain poisoning, 2020. How many of you remember SolarWinds? I hope you weren't a customer, but hey, we actually were the ones who were able to figure out by breaking apart their binary and telling them, we knew this would have happened, here's how, and here's what you can do to protect yourself moving forward. There's actually a whole case study on it. And then 2023, 3CX. And then dev tooling, kind of what I talked about with that Disney hack, right? The XE utils is also one that is more currently where, some guy was having, maybe some mental health problems, had asked for help for a very important package, logging app. And, Giotan just raised his hand and was like, hey, yeah, sure, I'll do it. So he looked like a good committer for a little while until he wasn't. And that's where he just injected a malicious code and ruined a lot of people's days quite quickly. So Again, that's a little bit more on the social engineering side, but we're starting to see more of these types of attacks, especially when it comes to dev tooling, even into the VS Code extensions that I talked about. So, this is my favorite slide. So what happens when they all kind of converge together? And this is really, because some of them can be multiple different things, right? It could be state-sponsored, it could be poisoning, it could be dev tooling, but also state-sponsored or poisoning, right? So the trick really becomes is how do we avoid the stampede? Automated security scans and CI/CD pipelines, good. Final build exam, great. You can't deliver or deploy without it. Like let's be honest. And then making sure we have reproducible builds. So some good countermeasures. It's tough, but it's challenging based off like hashes, or .NET has some good native support, but not everyone does. So we do it based off behaviors, and that's looking at the differential, analysis that I was mentioning earlier, or detecting build system tampering, or even improving ways where you can harden your solution, right? So I don't know if anybody else remembers this, but I had no idea there was a cheat code in this game. Did anybody, has anyone used this knowledge of it? No? Okay. Well, at least I'm not the only one. This makes me feel better. What I wanted to talk about though is why is there a cheat code and how do we help ourselves, right? And what is that cheat code when it comes to looking at malicious software or some of these things that we're seeing in the software supply chain space? And that cheat code, right, is what I've been showing a few times here, and that's secure.software. Free tool, right? There's tons of them out there, but I support one that has 6 billion files in it, so it's huge. We also are one of the largest contributors to the OpenSSF for providing that threat repository. And it's just another tool you can use to really help bolster that security. Just a final inspection to make sure hey, is this the right type of extension I want to be using? Does it pass tests? What's the history of the malware on this? How often is it tampered with? So this is just one free tool that you can use. Again, secure.software, super easy to remember. And this has, the 6 different categories. So I've talked a lot today. Key takeaways that I hope you guys had fun with this talk. Key takeaways is every choice you make matters. So if you're cutting corners, it will come to bite you probably at some point. You just don't know where. That could be in a, misconfiguration or sitting in legal. It's your choice. Collaboration is key. So those 3 players I mentioned in the beginning, while they have different goals, they're also working together, and that's to help create secure software that's just used by everybody. So you need to make sure that you're collaborating with your peers, whether that's in development, security, or operations, because at the end of the day, you do have one thing in common, and we talked about that. The other thing that I think is key is, you can't eliminate risk, so how are you going to manage it, right? You need to be able to understand that there is always a certain level of risk. It's just how are you going to manage it? What plans do you have in place for when something does go wrong, and how are you going to rectify it? I think the last thing, I always find this funny, but if you wouldn't raft blindfolded down the Columbia River, why would you deploy code you haven't fully vetted? And that's it. Thank you.
Amazing. Does anybody have any questions? We have a minute or two for questions. All right. Thank you very much for that presentation.
Thank you.
A round of applause for Kadi. All right, we're going to get things switched over here. Welcome to the newcomers in the back.